Hey there YouTube, this is Decid7 with a Tiny Leaders deck tech of my Ezuri Renegade Leader deck. If you are unsure what Tiny Leaders is, there will be a link in the description below to my introductory video to it. So without further ado, let's get to it. Ezuri Renegade Leader is a 2-2 for 1 and 2 green with the abilities tap a green, regenerate another target elf, and tap 2 and 3 green to give all elf creatures you control +3/+3 and trample until end of turn. The primary goal of the deck is to amass an army of elves, as well as an insane amount of mana, to pump into Ezuri's overrun ability and Alpha Strike for a massive amount of damage. Of course, sometimes this does not go exactly as planned, so there are a few other ways to sink all the mana that the deck can produce and 2 other ways to win. Starting off with the mana base, the deck runs a total of 15 lands, which is quite a bit lower than the usual recommendations of 18 lands for a Tiny Leaders deck. This is compensated by several elves that can produce mana by tapping them, and one elf that can make every elf in the deck produce mana. Accompanying the 9 basic forests, I run 6 non-basic lands in my deck, those being Cavern of Souls to ensure that the key components that do not get countered, Arcane Lighthouse so that I may deal with any problems that are Shroud and Hexproof, Guy's Cradle to tap for a massive amount of green mana equal to the number of creatures in the deck, that I can use to activate Ezuri's overrun ability multiple times, or into another menacing card. Myriad Landscape to help fish basic forests out of my deck. Wirewood Lodge to untap my elves and net even more mana to use. And Dryad Arbor as a manland to accelerate into play with a turn 1 Green Sun Zenith, or to have Guy's Cradle tap for additional green mana. Guy's Cradle is currently the only proxy in the deck, and I have plans of obtaining one very soon in the future. As for the creatures in the deck, we begin with the 3 mana dorks, as you would call them, Elvish Mystic, Llanowar Elves, and Fyndhorn Elves. All of these are 1/1s for 1 green mana that tap to add 1 green to your mana pool. Pretty simple, but very effective. The final elf that produces a maximum of 1 mana is Elvish Harbinger, and while 3 mana for a mana dork is expensive, the ability to Worldly Tutor for an elf, such as the elves I'm about to mention, is very helpful, and should the case arrive where I'm able to recur this effect, I'm able to set my board up to where I can gain the advantage. Moving on to some of the elves that can produce more than 1 mana, leading off the pack we have Heritage Druid and Nettle Sentinel combo. While I cannot run multiple Nettle Sentinels to fully combo and gain much more mana than I could due to the singleton nature of the format, I can still turn all my elves that do not tap for mana into mana and continue to cast spells from my hand at a breakneck pace. Next up, there is Priest of Titania and Elvish Archdruid. Both add mana equal to the number of elves I control, and the priest includes any elves my opponent plays. The Archdruid is helpful to give all my elves an anthem and make them less fragile. Rafella's Llanowar Emissary rounds off the super ramping elves, being quite clearly the most powerful of them, so much so that he is banned as commander. While he has a fragile body, in most cases where he sticks to the board, he can tap for a maximum of 10 mana alone. Combine any of these with Wirewood Lodge, and I can essentially double the amount of mana they can produce -1 for the activation of the Lodge. So what I do with all this mana, besides trying to activate Ezuri's overrun ability multiple times, is use it to cast a couple X spells, or in ways I can use it all to my advantage. The first of these would be to cast Primordial Hydra for as much mana as possible, doubling its 1/1 counters each turn turns it into a very big powerhouse with trample that is hard to deal with without the proper removal. Next up is Draga Warcaller. Being able to multi-kick him multiple times not only gives me a large elf to attack with, but also pumping my team up that many times and making them difficult to mount a defense against. Genesis Wave is next to talk about. While the amount I can cast this card for is limited by the deck size, as I do not want to mill myself to death, there are only 6 non-permanent spells in the main board, making nearly every casting of the spell instantly netting value. With converted mana costs also limited to 3 or under for the format, I can pretty much guarantee that Genesis Wave will be cast and turn the tides into my favor, setting me up for the victory either that turn or very soon. The final card of these mana 6 is Omnath, Locus of Mana. The purpose of using him in the deck is to store as much green mana as possible in him, so that I may use it to activate Ezuri, multi-kick Draga Warcaller, play Genesis Wave, or Primordial Hydra for a big number, or just simply swing with the big guy in himself. I only run 2 ramp spells in the deck, Cultivate and Rampant Growth. Obviously there are better ramp spells than Rampant Growth, but in all honesty, I just wanted to use my Texas promo version of the card. Cultivate has long been an EDH staple for ramping green decks and proves to be a good asset in this deck. Both spells help to fish out my basic lands in the deck to not only improve the quality of my draws, but also make Murphy's that much more important, allowing him to tap for more mana. In addition to Elvish Archdruid, I do run the other Elf Lords, those being Eladamri, Lord of Leaves, and Imperious Perfect. Before anyone asks, I do also run Elvish Champion in the sideboard, which I'll get to later in the video. Anyways, Eladamri is a good way to protect my elves, as well as give them much needed evasion when facing other green decks. While he does not grant himself Shroud or Forest Walk, or provide an Anthem buff like the other Elf Lords do, he may be the prime and only target for spot removal, but he helps protect the more valuable elves that I need to stick around. Imperious Perfect is a great way to buff my elves some, as well as provide a repeatable creature generating engine. The elf tokens he produces not only help power the mana producers such as Priest of Titania and Elvish Archdruid, but also allow for more power on my board to swing with. My post-sideboard plan is to turn this deck into a token strategy, and Imperious Perfect is a perfect elf lord to accomplish this, while still being a valuable player in pre-sideboard games. Now that I've gone over the core components of the deck, I'll move on to the more utility cards. I use Taunting Elf as a finishing play when I am about to attack for lethal damage. Its lurability makes it one of the MVPs of the deck and an unexpected threat. With artifacts like swords and enchantments and like Jeskai Sanity and Rest in Peace in the format, basically problem cards I cannot get rid of normally, both Reclamation Sage and Viridian Corruptor come in to take care of the business. While the Corruptor's Enter the Battlefield trigger is not a me ability, making my own artifacts at risk for being targets, it having Infect also gives it a way to close out a game if normal combat damage is not as much of an option, such as versus life gain decks. Courser of Kruphix is a wonderful addition to the deck, being very effective as a blocker as well as helping to accelerate lands out of the deck that I would otherwise draw, and being a source of life gain. In my opinion, Courser is the second best mono green creature in the format that can more or less fit into a wide variety of decks. I mentioned second best, and I'm now moving on to what I feel is the best mono green creature available in the format, Eternal Witness. Being able to recur any spell or creature in a deck makes it the most versatile card for what it does. An all-star in EDH, Eternal Witness is a card that should not go overlooked in any green deck in Tiny Leaders, even though it is one of the few non-elf cards in this particular deck. Jumping back into elves, next up is Elvish Visionary. Green card draw is already hard to come by, and it is especially limited given the format's mana cost restrictions. It is also a good way to further accelerate my game state by potentially drawing even more creatures to play to set up for a faster victory. Ren's Run Vanquisher is in this deck because of its overall lack of disadvantage in revealing an elf as an additional cost because of the deck's redundancy, but also because of its stats. It is very hard to beat the value of a 3/3 with Death Touch for 2 mana in the tribe. To finish off the creature base, we have Well-Wisher, the deck's main life-gaining component. As another elf that checks for elves in play that both players control, this card works very well with Wirewood Lodge as a way to gain 12 life per turn with 2 activations of the ability. Finally, moving on to non-creature spells, I run both Worldly Tutor and Green Sun Zenith as ways to fetch the key components that I need. Most often of the time, I cast Green Sun Zenith for X equal to 0 in order to fetch Dryad Arbor so I can, right out of the gate, be ahead on lands. Concorded Crossroads and Lightning Greaves both act as haste enablers in order to speed things up. Lightning Greaves has the pro of giving protection to whatever is wearing them, and Crossroads presents a high-risk, high-reward situation since it gives your opponent's creatures haste as well. Concorded Crossroads is the card that is essential for the deck's optimal start and potential turn 3 kill. Glimpse of Nature, an all-star in the Legacy Elves deck, makes its appearance here for more or less the same reason, although to a much less degree. Its ability to draw a massive amount of cards, which are mostly creatures, and be a way to fuel the fire, make it yet another reason why some people dub this format Legacy Light. As a cheaper alternative to Sensei's Divining Top, I play Mary's Guile instead. It is essentially one activation of top every upkeep for 0 mana, which is all I really need it for, since the deck is full of redundant cards, and there is no real need to continuously float an unwanted card amongst the top 3 cards of the deck. Beast Within is Green's primary removal spell in the format, being able to hit any type of permanent. Sure, the 3/3 beast that an opponent can receive may seem like a downside, but when the deck is pumping elves up both in number and in power, The Beast token just makes it one more tiny obstacle to push through. Elixir of Immortality is what I consider an auto-include in the deck, since the deck requires several cards in order to effectively close out a game. With those cards being quite fragile, being able to shuffle the graveyard back into the deck simply nets value. The 5 life gained from it also is a nice little bonus. Finally, we have Bow and Nylea. It is perhaps the card that generates the most utility in the deck because it does so much. In addition to giving my attacking creatures Death Touch, it is the only mainboard option to deal with small flyers aside from Beast Within. It is also a reputable source of life gain. Its ability to add a 1/1 counter to a creature makes Gerarda Warcaller even bigger, which would in turn pump the rest of my squad. And the final ability to put up to 4 cards back to the bottom of the deck, give the deck the ability to recast its cards that it needs. Now that I've gone over the main deck, I will quickly glance over the sideboard and my card choices. The idea here is mainly to turn the deck into more of a token deck as opposed to a standard tribal build, as well as provide some hateful flyers, which is the deck's main weakness aside from mass removal. Essence Warden comes in place of Well-Wisher more often, since the tokens generated not necessarily always elves, which hurts Well-Wisher's effectiveness. Windstorm is included as the spell that removes all of those pesky flyers from play. Spider Silk Armor gives my creatures a slight defense boost, as well as the ability to block flyers, where it previously couldn't, making the matchup versus decks having a lot of flying creatures much better. Wirewood Hive Master is the other main token generator aside from Imperious Perfect, as it creates a token every time I play an elf. That is not a token. Making a lot of insects puts pressure on the opponent and makes blocking during combat a bit harder for them unless they have an adequate number of creatures in order to deal with it. Primal Rage is included in order to give all of my creatures trample, as opposed to just my elves, which Ezuri grants. Giving Omnath, or even the mass army of insect tokens I can create trample, also make combat more difficult for the opponent to deal with. Elvish Champion is a lord that would come in during matchups where my opponent is running forests, but is not running an elf-based strategy. While this deck, being mono-green, does not have access to cards like Rest in Peace or Nihil Spellbomb, Ground Seal is what I would bring in against decks that rely heavily on utilizing the graveyard. Most often, this card denies Snapcaster Mage to be able to give a spell flashback, and stops Scavenging Oozes from growing larger. Being a more token-based strategy post-board, Fecundity soon becomes the deck's most effective card drawing spell. Sometimes this works against me, as it also allows my opponent to draw a fair amount of cards, but at nowhere near in which the rate I am able to. Guy's Blessing is my answer to mill-based strategies, as it shuffles the graveyard back into the deck when it gets milled. If it's drawn, it acts as yet another way to recruit some of the cards that have been milled away that I may need to answer this strategy. Finally, I run Helix Pinnacle as an alternative win condition. While it is a lot slower than the primary function of the deck, the time has come up where I've been put under a constant mists with buyback lock, and I could not close out a victory. This card helps ensure that the game does not drag on until a deck size becomes extremely relevant, and also provides the deck with another option to sink a massive amount of mana into that the deck can produce. Of course, my card choices may differ from what you may want to run in your Ezuri deck, and I am fully aware that there are better possible options. If you are looking to make a deck based around the Renegade leader, feel free to use my deck as a skeleton for yours, as well as a pool of ideas to draw from. If you have any suggestions as to how I may possibly improve the deck, or just want to see more deck techs in the future, feel free to write a comment and let me know. I greatly appreciate any feedback you have for me. Thank you all for watching. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel to show your support, and I'll see you all next time.